Okay, at this time, it's my great pleasure. We have for our second keynote speaker, Alain, who's head of unit corporate reporting, audit and credit rating agencies at DG FISMA, the European Commission. And he'll be speaking on global policy challenges in the field of sustainable finance, new investment risks, and opportunities. And Mr. Dekker has over 20 years of experience in public service at the European Commission. He's been responsible for policy reviews, policy developments in areas including trade and goods, environmental policy, public procurement, and financial services regulation. He currently heads a team of responsible for corporate reporting and transparency, including both financial and sustainability reporting. So very much welcome to the stage, Mr. Alain Dekker.
Good morning. Just to make sure I stick to the timing, I'm going to set my stopwatch so I don't ramble on for too long. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you, and thank you, Professor Whelan, for a very interesting presentation. If nothing else, what I take away from this is that we do actually have a killer argument for why we need to work on sustainability and addressing climate change, and it's that if we don't, we're going to run out of coffee, which, especially at this time of the day, I think is a very powerful argument. So I'll take that back to Brussels with me. So before I go further, I will make my own the habit that SEC staff, who I often encounter, in fact I've just spent some time with them in the last 2 days, of making a disclaimer and say that everything I say here today are just my views. They don't represent necessarily the views of my colleagues, individual members of the European Commission, nor even the official position of the European Commission. Second thing I'd like to emphasize that although I work in the Commission department that's dealing with financial markets and financial services, our work in this area is very much a team effort. We work very closely with colleagues in the environmental policy department and also the department dealing with climate change policy. Indeed, as was mentioned before, I started my career in the environmental policy department of the European Commission. So this is kind of, the last few years have been a return to my roots also. Thirdly, just before I get into substance, I'm going to refer mainly to climate change in my intervention. But of course, it is about much more than climate change. And there's a much broader environmental challenge that we need to deal with, and indeed also a social challenge, and there are of course very strong interactions between all these dimensions. Think about the potential social implications if large parts of South Asia, for example, are underwater in 20 years, and the consequences that will have for global migration, potential conflicts that all of that brings. So all of these things are interrelated. So before I plunge into the details, I'll just quickly lay out what the plan of what I'll say. I'll begin with a few sort of historical and slightly more academic, to kind of make the link with Professor Whelan also, considerations about the purpose of the corporation. I'll then link that to the rationale and the main elements of the Commission's work on sustainable finance. And finally, I've been asked to tease out what this might mean for US issuers and investors. I'm not actually sure that I can do that, and to be honest, I'd rather hear from you also what your views are about our work. I was struck when I arrived this morning. I went to the S&P stand to steal a pen because I wanted to fine-tune my speech. And the gentleman who was at the S&P stand said, "Oh, do you work on the taxonomy, on the sustainable finance taxonomy?" So clearly some people in this room already know at least some of what we're doing. But anyway, as a good bureaucrat, I have to try and sell you what we're doing. So let's begin with the purpose of the corporation. I'm sure that all of you know that in August of this year, the Business Roundtable released a new statement on the purpose of the corporation, which, amongst other things, commits signatories of that statement to, one, supporting communities in which they work, and to respect communities and protect the environment by embracing sustainable practices across their businesses. And secondly, generating long-term value for shareholders, which provide the capital that allows companies to invest, grow, and innovate, and so on. I think this new statement is a very welcome recognition that, one, the responsibilities of public corporations extend far beyond their shareholders and other creditors, and two, that short-term profit is not an appropriate metric even for shareholders. Certainly not if it comes at the expense of long-term value creation and sustainability. Of course, the debate about the purpose of the corporation is not new. It goes back at least to the early 1930s. And in the 1930s, it played out in the pages of Harvard Law Review between Adolph Burley, who was a distinguished American lawyer, educator, author, and diplomat, and Professor Merrick Dodd of Harvard Law School. It's very instructive to go back to those two articles that were published in 1932. And they were summarized in an article published in 2002 by the late Professor Lynn Andrew Stout, who at the time was Professor of Corporate and Securities Law at the UCLA School of Law. And she summarized their position as follows. I quote, Adolph Burley argued for what is now called the shareholder primacy view of the corporation. That is to say, the view that the corporation exists only to make money for its shareholder. And according to Burley, all powers granted to a corporation and to the management of a corporation or to any group within the corporation are at all times exercisable only for the rateable benefit of all the shareholders as their interest appears. Contrast that to the view of Merrick Dodd, who disagreed vehemently with Burley's shareholder primacy thesis. And he argued that a view of the business corporation as an economic institution which has a social service as well as a profit-making function. And Dodd claimed that the proper purpose of the corporation and the proper goal of corporate managers was not confined to making money for shareholders. It also included more secure jobs for employees, better quality of products for consumers, and greater contributions more generally to the welfare of the community as a whole. Now, interestingly, Adolph Burley conceded in 1954 in a book he published, whose title now escapes me, but that basically the argument had been settled squarely in favor of Professor Dodd's contention. That is to say that shareholder primacy was wrong. Now, to be sure, Burley's concession did not signal the death of the doctrine of shareholder primacy. Milton Friedman was a very vocal advocate, and he published a well-known article in 1970 in the New York Times arguing for the shareholder primacy view. And the view remains influential today amongst scholars of corporate law. And even a very recent academic paper about European corporate governance argues that the paper refers to as the Anglo-American law and economic concept of shareholder primacy has spread and gradually colonized European company law and the space it gives to corporate decision makers to decide on how best to run companies. So I think it's very noteworthy that the roundtable has taken this broader view of the role of the purpose of the corporation. And indeed, my own department has gone through, I think, a parallel transformation in the last 10 years. When I joined the team dealing with corporate reporting in 2007 for the first time, I joined just in time for the financial crisis, which kept us quite busy for a number of years. But if at the time we mentioned the word sustainability or climate change, it was probably by mistake. Today, sustainability is the single biggest work stream that we deal with in relation to financial markets. And indeed, in my own team, the work that we're doing on sustainability reporting is also the single biggest work stream we have in our team. Whereas when I joined, we would have been dealing mainly with exotic accounting standards on financial instruments, revenue recognition, and all these kind of fascinating things. So how is the purpose of the corporation relevant for what we're discussing here today? Well, it's relevant first because, as Professor Wheeler explained, we face what really is, I think, a civilizational challenge with climate change, and as I said, all the environmental and social challenges that are linked to that. And while the public sector must play a very important role to address those challenges, including by mobilizing public funds, which is something we're trying to do in Europe, the private sector is going to have to play an absolutely critical role. There is simply no way that the public sector will be able to mobilize the necessary funds to deal with the climate challenge that we face. So corporations, investors must become fully part of not only the challenge but also the solution. And second, to anticipate a point I'll return to later, and which is the main issue that I deal with, a lot of this is going to require a better understanding of what companies do, how investors address these challenges, and that immediately raises the question of disclosure and transparency of corporations and investors. And indeed, that is the core of the work that we are dealing with in my department. All of this involves big challenges, but I think it also offers great opportunities, especially for those who grasp the nettle early, because they will be able to exploit the benefits that will also come with what I hope will be a very significant transformation of the financial sector. So what are we doing in the European Commission? Well, in 2018, we published a quite wide-ranging action plan on financing sustainable growth. This is oriented around three main policy goals. One, reorienting capital flows towards sustainable investments in order to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. Two, managing the financial risks stemming from climate change, resource depletion, environmental degradation, and related social issues. And three, fostering transparency and long-termism in financial and economic activities. And I'm glad that some of these themes echo also the themes that were mentioned by Amina Mohammed in her video address. These goals reflect a recognition that current levels of investments are not sufficient, notably to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that we need to close the gap sooner rather than later, because we don't have a lot of time to achieve this. Financial entities, investors, authorities need to be able to identify, measure, and price transition risks that climate change brings about. And because climate affects society as a whole and constitutes a systemic challenge, another dimension which is key and which we are dealing with also in our work is not only the dependencies that company and investment performance has on external factors such as climate challenges, but also the impacts that companies have on the external environment. This is what we refer to as the double materiality perspective. It is a key element of our legal framework on ESG disclosures, and I'll come back to that later on. So, following the publication of the action plan in 2018, we tabled three main legislative proposals to implement the objectives of the action plan. One is the item I mentioned earlier, which is an EU classification system for sustainable economic activities. This is what we call the taxonomy of sustainable finance. And the negotiations about this proposal are in full flow. Indeed, I got an email earlier from my colleague saying the negotiations were interrupted at 4 o'clock in the morning in Brussels, and they were going to resume at 8 o'clock in the morning. So this is a very topical issue at the moment. The taxonomy, just to clear up any misunderstandings, is not about forcing investors to allocate funds to any particular types of activities. It is a tool to classify the sustainability of different types of economic activities and thereby to bring about greater transparency about the ways in which investors allocate their funds. The second proposal we have tabled is on the disclosures of sustainability factors by financial markets participants. In fact, in the final text that was agreed, the scope was broadened to pretty much all financial institutions. And again, this covers environmental, social, and governance considerations in the decision-making process of investors and asset managers with a view to facilitating investments in sustainable projects and assets. And one of the key objectives behind this proposal is to discourage greenwashing, which unfortunately is still an important feature in the market. Again, I'll come back to that later on. And then the third key proposal we tabled at the time were the creation of two new categories of climate benchmarks, which should help to better understand how investments contribute to meeting the Paris targets on decarbonization of the economy. So with the exception of the proposal on the taxonomy, which as I mentioned is currently in full flow of negotiations, we already had agreements on the other two, and we hope to reach agreement on the taxonomy text, the regulation on the taxonomy by the end of this year. We'll see whether we make that, but that's very much our objective. But that isn't the whole thing. That isn't everything we're doing. We're going into a range of other issues. We have set up a technical expert group, which some of you may have heard about. The expert group has done very considerable work to establish the first version or the first draft of the taxonomy, focusing on climate-related aspects. We do intend to continue working with that expert group on developing the taxonomy to other areas. And in June of this year, the expert group published a number of reports on other aspects of sustainable finance, which are available on our website, and I very much encourage you to look at. Something that my own team worked on over the course of the last 2 years is producing some guidelines on climate disclosures by issuers. The objective of those guidelines is to explain how we see the TCFD recommendations fitting into the implementation of our legislation on disclosure on ESG matters. In parallel to that, we have also been, and we're now finalizing an evaluation of our broader framework on corporate reporting by issuers,